The rain was pouring down, as if there were a hole in the sky. She stood before the gates of the Duke of the North's estate, her wedding dress soaked through and clinging to her body, shivering so hard her teeth were chattering. No one came out to greet her, no umbrellas, no servants, not even someone to open the gate. She clutched her flimsy suitcase, rain dripping from her hair into her eyes, stinging so badly she wanted to cry, but she couldn't cry. She had come here as a substitute bride. Her sister had run away, and her father had pointed a finger at her and said, "You go." Just 2 words had sealed her fate for life. She had been shoved into a carriage from her warm Viscount's estate in the south, jostled for a full 11 days, crossing half the kingdom, to arrive in this northern realm, shrouded in perpetual mist. The coachman dumped her at the estate gates and ran off, saying he wasn't familiar with the Duke of the North's lands and had to get back to town before dark, lest he run into those unclean things on the road. At the time, she'd wanted to ask what those unclean things were, but now she didn't care. She just wanted to get inside. The rain stung her skin like fine needles. If she stood there any longer, she was bound to catch a fever. She clutched the manuscript in her palm. The rain had already soaked it, blurring the ink. It was a gift from her sister, detailing the various rules of the Duke of the North's estate. Never look the master in the eye, never make a sound in the corridors, never enter the east wing, never touch a single rose in the garden, never laugh in the Duke's presence, never cry, never speak, and it would be best to breathe as quietly as possible. Back then, as she read the manuscript, she thought, this isn't getting married. It's like going to prison. But now, she couldn't even get through the prison door until she saw the side gate of the garden open a crack. The iron gate was rusty, and vines had completely overtaken the fence, as if no one had walked through there in ages. She hesitated for 3 seconds. The rain grew heavier, so she gritted her teeth, pushed the gate open, and stepped inside. Later, she learned from the old butler that this was the Duke's forbidden territory. The most off-limits place in the entire northbound manor was not the secret chamber in the east wing, nor the underground wine cellar, but this very garden, because the Duke was here. Almost every afternoon, he would spend time here alone, sitting in his wheelchair facing the wall of roses blooming in a wild, alluring display, sitting motionless for hours on end. No one dared to disturb him. The last maid to wander into the garden had been sent away the very next day without even receiving her severance pay. But she knew nothing of that at the time. All she saw was the garden bursting with roses in the rain, their deep red petals trembling slightly as raindrops struck them. The air thick with a sweet scent so intense it bordered on rot. In the very center of the garden stood a stone pavilion, and inside it sat a figure. The wheelchair was turned away from her. First, she saw the hands hanging down on either side of the wheelchair, long-fingered, pale as if almost transparent, with faint blue veins visible on the backs. Then came the profile. In the misty rain of the north, that half-face resembled an oil painting with blurred edges, deep-set brow bones, a straight nose, and lips pressed tightly into a cold, hard line. She didn't know what to say. The sound of the rain was too loud. She wanted to speak, but then remembered the note on the manuscript forbidding her to speak, and she forced the hello that was on the tip of her tongue back down her throat. Just then, a soaking wet orange cat suddenly darted out of the rose bushes and collided head-on with her calf. She looked down to see the cat was completely drenched, so thin its ribs were visible. Its pair of yellow eyes gazed at her pitifully, letting out a hoarse meow. She instinctively crouched down and scooped the cat into her arms. The cat trembled against her chest, its icy fur brushing against her collarbone. She could feel its tiny heart beating fast and frantically. "You've had it rough, haven't you?" she whispered, completely forgetting the rules on her manuscript. "Soaked by the rain like this and no one to look after you." Holding the cat, she looked up and saw the wheelchair turn toward her. Then she saw the Duke of the North's face. This face was more handsome than any rumor had suggested, and colder than any rumor had suggested. His eyes were deep gray, like the leaden skies of a winter in the north, and when he looked at her, there was not a shred of warmth. But his legs, she instinctively glanced at the heavy blanket draped over his knees. Beneath it, the space was empty, and on the footrests of the wheelchair, his legs rested in an unnatural posture, gaunt and rigid. He looked at her as if she were a moth that had accidentally flown into a window pane. With indifference and weariness, the rumors were true. The Duke of the North had been gravely wounded in the rebellion 3 years prior, sustaining spinal damage that left his legs completely numb. Once the kingdom's youngest battlefield legend, he could now not even stand. Some say his temper had grown dark and violent. Others say he had shut himself away in his estate, never to be seen again. Still others say that not a single woman sent to the Duke's mansion had lasted more than 3 months. The last one to be sent back, it was said, had sneaked into his bed at night, only to be thrown out by him, her shoulder dislocated, weeping all the way back to the south. Her fate was sealed the moment she was forcibly shoved into the carriage and sent on her way. She was nothing more than another sacrifice offered up to him. The daughter of a minor southern noble, she had no connections, no wealth, and no backing. Her only value lay in fulfilling this political marriage on her sister's behalf, so her father could secure mining rights from the Duke of the North. You see, it was a transaction of interests, laid bare. She knew it all. From the moment she picked up the manuscript her sister had thrown on the ground, she knew she was a pawn. But even pawns have their own way of living. She hadn't thought of running away, because even if she did, there was nowhere to go. She just hadn't expected her first test to come so soon. The Duke's gaze slowly shifted from her face to the cat in her arms. The orange cat was rubbing its wet head against her chin, completely unaware of the trouble it had caused. "Throw it out." He spoke. His voice was low, hoarse as if steeped in the marrow of long silence. It wasn't anger, nor was it a command. It was a tone so matter of fact it might as well have been saying, "The weather's bad today." She froze. That cat, his gaze settled on the animal, as if it were a pile of unsightly trash. "Throw it out. No living creatures are allowed in the garden." She instinctively clutched the cat tighter to her chest. The cat was pitifully thin, its fur matted. It was clearly a stray that had been wandering for a long time. Late autumn in the north was so cold, if she threw it out, it wouldn't survive the winter. It was just seeking shelter from the rain, she said, only realizing she'd been talking back the moment the words left her mouth. A line from the manuscript flashed through her mind. "Never look your master in the eye." She hurriedly looked away, clutching the cat even tighter. "I'll take it with me as soon as the rain stops. It won't dirty your garden." The man in the wheelchair didn't respond. The silence dragged on so long, she thought he'd given his tacit approval. Just as she was about to breathe a sigh of relief, she heard him suddenly say something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "Come here." Just 2 words. She looked up and found his deep gray eyes fixed firmly on her. It was no longer the detached glance of before, but a scrutiny, like a needle, as if he intended to pick her apart from the inside out. She took a few steps forward, cradling the cat, as rainwater trailed a wet streak along the hem of her skirt. When she reached the edge of the stone pavilion, she stopped. Only now, up close, could she make out the silver wolf crest of the Duke of the North's family embroidered on his blanket. The wolf's eyes were set with deep blue gemstones, glowing faintly in the dim light of the rainy day. A little closer, she took another step forward. Now she was less than 2 meters away from him. She could smell the scent emanating from him. Not perfume, but a faint aroma of cedar mixed with the must of old book pages, cold and aged. They stood facing each other, in silence, for a long time. The sound of the rain gradually subsided. Petals from the garden's roses, beaten loose by the rain, littered the ground, their red hues spreading across the blue stone path like pools of diluted blood. The orange cat in her arms gradually settled down, purring softly, a sound that seemed particularly jarring in the dead silence. Then, completely against her expectations, the Duke's mouth suddenly curved slightly. It wasn't a smile. At most, it was an involuntary twitch of the muscles at the corner of his mouth. But something in his eyes had indeed changed, subtly, like a dark current suddenly surging from the deepest depths beneath the ice. In that very instant, her manuscript slipped out of her soaked pocket and clattered onto the stone pavement. She hurriedly bent down to pick it up, but he was faster. Though confined to a wheelchair, his hand shot out like lightning, two long pale fingers clamping down on the paper, which was already on the verge of disintegrating. He unfolded the manuscript. The rain had already blurred most of the writing, but the final line was still barely legible. Do not look directly into the master's eyes. Do not make a sound in the corridors. Do not enter the east wing. Do not touch any of the roses in the garden. Do not smile in the Duke's presence. Do not cry. Do not speak. The last half of the sentence was left with only half the ink. As if the sentence had been violently severed, she saw him staring at that half sentence, his brow furrowing ever so slightly. Then he crumpled the manuscript into a ball and casually tossed it into the rosebush beside him. "These rules," he said, his voice finally carrying a hint of what might be called emotion, a touch of sarcasm, or perhaps something deeper. "Who told you them?" She pressed her lips together, her mind racing. She wondered whether to mention her sister's name, whether to implicate her father, whether to— Never mind. He cut off the answer she hadn't yet voiced, rolling his wheelchair back half an inch. "I don't want to know." He turned away, facing the wall of roses once more, the lines of his profile hardening into cold detachment. The gesture was a clear, unambiguous conclusion. "This topic is over. You may leave." She stood where she was, holding the cat. The rain had stopped completely. A tear opened in the northern sky, revealing a sliver of pale light that fell upon the damp garden, coating everything in a thin layer of silver. She really should leave. The manuscript listed so many rules, and she hadn't followed a single one. It was a miracle she hadn't been thrown out on the spot. But as she watched that solitary figure, the heavy blanket draped over his knees, and the rain-shattered petals scattered around his wheelchair, she suddenly realized that this man, this Duke of the North, legendary for his inhuman cruelty, this crippled war machine, feared by the entire kingdom, was simply someone who had been alone for too long, so long that he could not even tolerate a cat running into the garden, so long that all his tenderness had been ground down into blades, directed at others and at himself. "My lord," she said, her voice soft, as if afraid of disturbing something. He didn't turn around, nor did he answer. She lifted the orange cat in her arms just a little higher, letting its head peek out over her shoulder. The cat meowed reluctantly, its voice soft and muffled, as if in protest. "It asks you," she said, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would leap out of her throat. "If it can stay, it catches mice, isn't picky about food, and—" she paused, "and it says your garden is too stuffy, it needs a little life." Dead silence. Even the wind had stopped. The rose petals ceased to tremble, and the droplets on the eaves of the stone pavilion froze at the edges, lingering for what seemed like an eternity. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding against her eardrums. Thump, thump, as if knocking on a locked door. The man in the wheelchair didn't move, but his shoulders, those stone, hard shoulders encased in a military-style black coat, suddenly shifted ever so slightly. Then he turned his head. It was, at that very moment, on this rain-soaked afternoon, in this garden steeped in legend, curses and bloodshed. She had achieved, with a stray cat and a clumsy joke, what no one in the entire North had managed to do in 3 whole years. The Duke of the North smiled. It wasn't a twitch at the corner of his mouth, nor a sarcastic sneer, but a genuine smile welling up from the depths of his eyes. It was faint, so faint it seemed it might shatter the very next second, yet it existed undeniably for that brief instant. The fine lines at the corners of his eyes softened slightly, and within his deep gray irises, a crack appeared in the permafrost that had remained frozen for years. The light that shone through that crack made her breath catch in her throat. Before she could react, she saw his hand rise, reaching toward her slowly, as if it took great effort. His fingertips hovered in midair, a palm's length from her face, and paused. "What is your name?" It was the first question he had asked her since she had entered the estate. She opened her mouth to answer, but saw his expression change suddenly. It wasn't anger, nor was it disgust. It was something deeper, darker, and heavier. A wariness and self-mockery found only on the faces of those who have suffered a great betrayal. He withdrew his hand, placing it back on the blanket draped over his knees, his knuckles clenched so tightly that the veins stood out. The smile that had begun to form at the corner of his mouth was forcibly suppressed, replaced by a mask even colder than before. "Don't bother telling me," he said, his voice returning to that tone so flat it bordered on cruelty. "The name doesn't matter. You married into this family because of the mine your father owes me. I know that. How long you stay here depends on how long you can keep your place. 3 months, 6 months, or climb into my bed tonight, only to be thrown out. It's all the same." He turned his wheelchair and headed down the path deep into the garden. The wheels ground against the wet flagstones, emitting a squeaking sound that rang particularly jarringly in the silent garden. She didn't follow him. Holding the cat, she watched him slowly disappear around the corner of the rose-covered wall, leaving only a corner of the silver wolf-crested blanket flashing briefly in the dim light. The orange cat rubbed against her, purring contentedly in its throat, completely unaware of what had just happened. She lowered her head, burying her face in the cat's damp fur, and caught the scent of rain mixed with earth. Her heart was still racing. That fleeting smile wasn't her imagination. She saw it clearly. For that fraction of a second, the man the entire kingdom had branded a cold-hearted monster had warmth in his eyes. It was as if a smoldering ember, buried deep within the frozen earth, had been gently stirred by something, sending sparks flying and glowing for a split second. But that was all. He snuffed out that flicker of light with emotion, so practiced it seemed he'd rehearsed it countless times. This was the Duke of the North. This was the man she would have to face for the rest of her life. And she had just done something extremely dangerous. She had made him smile. This meant she was no longer merely a quiet, easily overlooked ornament. From this moment on, she had become a variable, an unexpected factor, a presence he would have to reassess. And in this northern manner, layered with conspiracies and curses, any unexpected factor must be eliminated. This was a rule not written in her sister's manuscript, yet one she instinctively knew deep in her bones. Deep in the garden, roses hung their heads quietly after the rain, droplets of water falling one by one from their petals, hitting the mud and making a faint, almost inaudible sound. In the distance, the main building of the estate stood gloomily beneath a leaden sky, every window a black void, like countless impenetrable eyes. She finally understood. She was not merely a pawn. She was the one cast into a frozen tomb. And that man in the wheelchair was either her tomb or the layer of permafrost she intended to break open with her own hands. But in any case, she had already stepped inside. The garden gate creaked behind her, pushed by the wind, and slowly closed. The orange cat purred incessantly in her arms, as if it had found the safest haven in the world. She was still standing in the garden. The rain had stopped completely, but the wind had picked up. The winds of the north aren't as gentle as those of the south. They carry a brash, unyielding force, whistling through the rose bushes as if someone were weeping from afar. She shivered. Water was still dripping from the hem of her skirt, and the blue flagstones beneath her feet had been soaked by the rain until they were slippery, forcing her to tread carefully with every step. Holding the cat close, she turned to head back the way she'd come, intending to exit through the rusty iron gate. What the heck, she'd already broken every rule there was to break. One more wouldn't make a difference. But no sooner had she taken 2 steps than she heard hurried footsteps behind her. A gray-haired old man jogged through the rose bushes and came to a halt in front of her, panting heavily. He was dressed in a crisp, ironed black butler's uniform, with a silver wolf crest pin fastened to his collar, but the hem of his shirt was tucked in crookedly, and he exuded a sense of frantic panic. "Madam," he called out, then immediately clapped his hand over his mouth, as if afraid of being overheard, lowering his voice. "Madam, what are you doing here? You mustn't be here. Quick, come with me." She recognized him. This must be the butler. The manuscript had mentioned him. His name was Albert, and he'd served at the Duke of the North's estate for 40 years. He was the only one who dared to serve tea when the Duke was in a rage. But the manuscript also noted, the butler detested newcomers who didn't know their place. She instinctively took a half step back, tucking the cat closer to her chest. When the butler saw the cat, his face turned deathly pale, as if he'd spotted a live, leaping tiger. "Good heavens, my lady, you've brought a cat inside." His voice cracked. "His Grace detests any living creature in the garden. Last month, a wild pigeon flew in, and he had every nest in the tree torn down. You must put that thing outside at once before His Grace." "He saw the cat," she said. The butler's mouth hung open, his voice caught in his throat, his entire body frozen as if under a spell. "He didn't chase me away," she added, "nor did he throw the cat out." The butler stared at her, his cloudy old eyes flashing through several layers of emotion. First shock, then disbelief, and finally settling on something extremely subtle, akin to awe. He seemed to appraise her anew, his gaze sliding from her soaking wet hair to the purring orange cat in her arms, and from the cat to the mud-splattered hem of her skirt. Then he made a move that took her by surprise. He bent down. It wasn't a perfunctory nod, but a genuine, deep bow of the kind reserved for one's master. His back arched like a bow, the gray-streaked nape of his neck turned toward her, a small, indelible tea stain on his shirt collar. "Madam," his voice had changed, no longer the panicked tone of moments ago, but a steady, solemn inflection. "Please follow me. I'll show you to your room." She followed the butler through the side gate of the garden and into the main building of the Duke of the North's estate. If what she had felt in the garden moments ago was a kind of desolate beauty, then the interior of this building could be described with only one word: oppressive. The corridor was long and narrow, its walls lined with portraits of successive dukes of the North, from the first founder of the city all the way to the late duke of the previous generation, all gazing down at every passerby with the same icy stare. The wall sconces were unlit. The only source of light came from an absurdly tall stained glass window at the end of the corridor. The light streamed through the dark red glass, bathing the entire corridor in a hue that made it resemble a blood vessel leading to the heart. The butler walked ahead at a brisk pace. The sound of his leather shoes tapping against the flagstones echoed eerily through the empty corridor. She followed behind, cradling the cat in her arms, her soaked skirt dragging along the floor, leaving a winding trail of water in its wake. They passed by more than a dozen tightly closed doors. Every door was made of the same dark brown oak, fitted with cold iron handles. There were no nameplates, no markings. She had no way of telling where each one led. The air was thick with a musty scent. Not mold, but a drier, more stifling odor, as if all emotion had been sucked into the walls and sealed away. "The east wing is off limits," the butler said without turning his head, his tone as matter of fact as if he were reciting a menu. "Your room is on the 3rd floor of the west wing. Take the stairs at the end of the hallway, turn left, and it's the 3rd door. The bathhouse is at the other end of the hallway. Hot water is available from 7 o'clock to 9 p.m. The dining room is on the 2nd floor. Breakfast is at 7:30, lunch at noon, and dinner at 6:30. No exceptions. His Grace the Duke does not usually dine in the dining room, but should he appear, please do not speak to him of your own accord." As she listened to these rules, her head buzzed. Her sister's manuscript had contained so much, yet now it seemed woefully inadequate. This estate was like a vast, intricate cage, every bar hidden in the shadows. You only knew it was there when you bumped into it. One more thing. The butler suddenly stopped in his tracks, turned around, and fixed his aged eyes directly on her. "As for the garden, please do not do that again." "What is it?" she asked. Making his Grace laugh, the butler said in a voice so low, it was nearly drowned out by the draft in the hallway. "I know you might think it's no big deal, or even a good thing, but in this estate, any change is dangerous. His Grace's current state is a delicate balance. His coldness, his reclusiveness, his resistance to everyone. It's a form of self-preservation. Do not shatter it. Protection." She furrowed her brow. "Protection for whom? To protect him or to protect others from being hurt by him?" The butler did not answer. He merely gave her a very heavy, very solemn look. There was so much complexity in that gaze, a warning concern, and a hint of something she couldn't quite decipher, almost like a plea. Then he turned and continued walking. She followed him upstairs. The 3rd floor was darker than the 1st. Only a single wall sconce illuminated the hallway. Its dim yellow light stretched her, and the butler's shadows long and flat against the opposite wall, like 2 flattened paper figures. The butler stopped in front of the 3rd door, fished a slender brass key from the keyring at his waist, inserted it into the lock, and turned it twice. The door opened, and a dry, dusty scent hit her face. The room was larger than she had imagined, containing a 4-poster bed draped in dark red velvet, a carved writing desk, a full-length mirror, and a window facing the estate's rear mountains. The light outside had already dimmed, and the outlines of the mountains had turned into a deep blue silhouette in the twilight. "There are changes of clothes in the wardrobe, all prepared according to your sister's measurements, so they may not fit you well." The butler stood in the doorway without entering. "I'll have a maid come take your measurements tomorrow morning and have a few new sets made." She picked up on the implications of his words, prepared according to her sister's measurements. That meant this marriage had been tailor, made for her sister from the very beginning. She was merely a last-minute substitute. The clothes didn't fit. Her status didn't fit. Not even this bed, this room, or this estate belonged to her. She placed the cat on the bed. The orange cat immediately curled up into a fluffy ball on the dark red comforter, licked its paws, closed its eyes, and began purring within 3 seconds. She watched it and suddenly felt a twinge of envy. It must be wonderful to be a cat. As long as there's a place to sleep, you don't have to think about anything. "Madam." The butler called out to her again. She turned her head. The butler stood in the doorway. The hallway behind him was pitch black, and he was framed by the doorframe like a faded old photograph. His lips moved as if he wanted to say something, but in the end he merely sighed. "The bathroom is at the end of the hallway," he repeated. "Hot water is available from 7 to 9. Then he gently closed the door. The room fell into silence. She stood where she was, listening to the butler's footsteps gradually fade away until they vanished into the depths of the hallway. The last glimmer of light outside the window faded, and the room grew completely dark, save for the warm orange glow emanating from the tabby cat on the bed. It was her imagination, of course, but it did lend a touch of living warmth to this cold, unfamiliar room. She walked to the window and pushed it open. A cold breeze swept in, carrying that damp, earthy scent and the fresh fragrance of pine needles unique to the north. Behind the distant mountains, a faint, slender silver band of light was visible, the border river of the north. Moonlight spilled across the water's surface, like a knife stretched out to its full length. She suddenly remembered an ancient proverb from the borderlands between the north and the south. The moon of the north does not shine upon the living, but only upon the dead. At the time, she had thought it was just a ghost story meant to scare children. But now, standing here and gazing at the border river glinting coldly in the moonlight, she suddenly understood the meaning of those words. Everything in the north was cold, hard, and silent. There was more beneath the ground than above it. Why did my sister run away? The question exploded in her mind. She hadn't had time to think it through before. From the moment her father shoved her into the carriage, she'd been like a stone flung from a slingshot, hurtling all the way here with no turning back and no time to think. But now, standing in this room that wasn't hers, wearing a wedding gown that wasn't hers, tending to a stray cat that didn't belong to this estate, she finally began to ask herself that question. Her sister had agreed to this marriage of her own free will. She remembered it clearly. 3 months ago, when the Duke's envoys came to propose, her sister had accepted the betrothal gifts with a smile, and even put on a show of shyness in front of their father. But just 3 days before the wedding, she ran away. She left with nothing. Her clothes, jewelry, even the pearl necklace her mother had left her remained on the dressing table. She took only a small bundle and her personal maid. What could have driven someone who was originally willing to marry to flee for her life at the last moment? The manuscript. The image of that manuscript, crumpled into a ball by the Duke and tossed into the flower beds, flashed through her mind. Her sister had written so many rules, so many taboos. Every line exuded a near neurotic fear. She must have discovered something during the wedding preparations, something that could not be put into words, a secret deeper and darker than never look your master in the eye. At this thought, a sudden chill shot up her spine. It wasn't the wind was cold, but this chill seemed to seep out from between her bones. She sensed something in this room watching her, not a person, not a cat, but the manor itself, its walls, its floors, every tightly shut door, and every half-open window. All were silently observing her, recording her, waiting for her to make a mistake. She closed the window, turned, and walked over to sit by the bed. The orange cat was startled awake by her movement. It stretched and nuzzled its head into her palm. As she stroked the soft fur on the back of its neck, her heartbeat gradually calmed. No matter what secrets this estate held, no matter why her sister had fled, she was already here. Whether she was a pawn or a decoy, what she needed to do now was not to be afraid, but to figure out exactly how this game was being played. Just then, a sound suddenly came from the hallway. It wasn't footsteps, but a deeper rhythmic sound, creak, creak, creak. She recognized it, the sound of a wheelchair's wheels grinding across the floor. It was slow and heavy, each movement grinding against her nerves. The sound grew closer and closer, until it finally stopped, right outside her door. She didn't move. The cat froze on her lap, ears pricked straight up, tail bristling into a fluffy ball. There was no knock. Nothing happened. The wheelchair remained there, just on the other side of the door, sharing the same darkness with her. She could sense his presence. That crisp cedar scent seemed to seep through the crack in the door, creeping into her nostrils and reminding her of his deep gray eyes in the stone pavilion. They stood there, locked in a standoff. She was inside the door, he was outside, separated by a layer of oak and a wall of silence. Then the wheelchair moved. The creaking sound returned, this time growing fainter as it traveled down the hallway toward the east wing. The east wing, the forbidden zone. She found herself clenching her fists, her nails digging deep into her palms, leaving 4 crimson crescent-shaped marks. She had actually been expecting him to knock. The thought startled her. The orange cat relaxed again, yawned, and buried its head in the blankets, drifting back to sleep. But she could no longer find peace. Her mind was a chaotic jumble. The butler's warning, her sister's manuscript, the Duke's fleeting smile, and that suffocating wait in the hallway just moments ago. All these things swirled together in her head, tangled and impossible to untangle. She stood up and walked to the full-length mirror, studying her reflection in the faint moonlight streaming through the window. Her soaked hair clung to her forehead. The makeup on her face had long since been washed away by the rain. 2 faint dark circles lay beneath her eyes. Her lips were chapped and peeling. She looked utterly bedraggled, like a rag doll pulled from the water. But that wasn't the point. The point was the pair of eyes in the mirror. She realized her gaze had changed. It wasn't fear, nor was it resentment. It was something even she found unfamiliar. It was the calm and alertness of an animal backed into a corner, the resolve of someone who knew the next step led to a cliff and had to plant each foot firmly. She saw her lips move slightly in the mirror, silently uttering a sentence to herself. I cannot be sent back. That was the bottom line. She could not be sent back. For a bride sent back in the southern aristocratic circles, it was worse than death. No one would marry her again, and her father would send her even farther away, trading her for something of even less value. Her life had been staked on the gambling table the moment she was shoved into that carriage. A single chip pitted against the most dangerous man in all of the North. And today, in the garden, she had unwittingly played a card she shouldn't have. She had made that man laugh. The butler had warned her it was dangerous, and she believed him. But she didn't believe his other remark, that the Duke was protecting himself. She didn't think the Duke needed protection. That cold detachment wasn't a shield, it was a fortress wall. And if there was even a single crack in that wall, it meant that what lay within was far more terrifying than the enemies outside. She had to know where that crack led. The moment that thought took shape, a sound echoed through the hallway once more. This time it wasn't a wheelchair, but footsteps, light and hurried, with that distinctive staccato rhythm of a woman's stride. The sound came from the direction of the east wing, pausing for half a second as it passed her door. She was certain she hadn't misheard. The person had hesitated just outside her door, before hastening away down the stairs and vanishing into the ground floor. She quietly opened the door and peered out, leaning halfway into the hallway. The corridor was empty, save for a faint, lingering scent near the staircase. Not perfume, but the smell of some kind of ointment, bitter and pungent. The east wing. The east wing again. She retreated back into her room, closed the door, and saw that the orange cat on the bed had woken up at some point and was staring at her with its bright yellow eyes. That look seemed to say, "Woman, why aren't you asleep yet? Curiosity will be the death of you." But that night, she lay awake until 2 in the morning. Lying in bed, she listened to the wind howling through the northern realms night, to the faint vibrations deep within the walls that sounded like someone whispering, and to the orange cat's steady breathing, her mind churning like a wound-up water wheel. She began piecing together all the information her sister had left behind. The rules on the manuscript, every single one was tinged with fear, but the object of that fear wasn't the abstract, North, but a specific person. Do not look the master in the eyes. Do not make a sound in the hallway. Do not enter the east wing. Do not touch the roses in the garden. Wait a minute. She sat up abruptly. The roses in the garden. Her sister had specifically written that rule, implying those roses were something so important they must not be touched. But today she had stood in the garden for so long. Those roses were just roses, blooming vibrantly, smelling sweet, nothing more than a rare variety. Why couldn't they be touched? Unless they weren't roses at all. She recalled the moment earlier that day in the stone pavilion, when the Duke had been staring at that wall of roses. There had been an emotion in his eyes she hadn't understood at the time. It wasn't admiration, nor was it disgust. It was something closer to mourning, When he looked at those roses, he wasn't looking at the flowers. The next morning, she was woken by the cat's paws. The orange cat was perched on her chest, tapping her chin with its paw. One tap, one meow. It was hungry. She struggled to open her eyes and found that it was already light out. The sky beyond the window was a hazy gray. That was how the sky was in the north, where the sun was never visible, only layer upon layer of varying shades of gray, as if someone had smudged the sky with a pencil countless times. She washed up quickly, pulled a dark blue long dress from the wardrobe that was barely wearable, clearly not her size, with the waistline an inch too low, and the sleeves a bit too long, making her look like a child who'd stolen an adult's clothes. She rolled up the sleeves, tied the excessively long hem with a hair tie, and headed out with the cat in her arms. The hallway looked slightly less oppressive in the daylight. At least faint sunlight filtered in through the stained glass window at the end, casting a dull red glow around the portraits of her ancestors on the walls. She descended the stairs to the second-floor dining room. The door was open, and the room was empty. The dining room was spacious, with a long table set in the center of the hall, its surface covered with the snow, white tablecloth and a row of silver cutlery. At the head of the table stood a chair, not an ordinary chair, but a wheelchair identical to the one she had seen in the garden yesterday, only this one was taller and wider, with a silver wolf crest engraved on the armrests. This was where the Duke sat when he dined. She hesitated for a moment, then instead of sitting at the long table, she walked around to a small round table by the window and sat down. Her sister's notes had said, "Never sit in the Duke's seat when he is absent, nor in any chair too close to his." She didn't know which chair counted as too close, so she simply chose the one farthest away. After waiting about 5 minutes, a middle-aged maid wearing an apron walked in carrying a tray. She visibly startled when she saw Serena, then quickly lowered her head, set the tray on the small round table, and lifted the lid to reveal a bowl of oatmeal, 2 slices of dark toast, and a cup of unsweetened black tea. "Please enjoy your meal, madam." The maid spoke and then scurried out, as if lingering a single second longer would expose her to a contagious plague. She glanced at the food on the tray, then at the orange cat in her arms staring longingly at the bread. She sighed, broke off half a slice, and placed it on the chair beside her. The orange cat immediately pounced, pinned the slice down with both front paws, and began devouring it voraciously. She sipped her unsweetened black tea, which tasted like chewing wax, while her mind raced. She was pondering a question. Would the Duke show up at breakfast today? The butler had said he usually didn't eat in the dining room, but what if he did? She needed to see him, yet she feared seeing him. These two emotions twisted together in her heart, tightening like a rope that made her stomach clench. But the Duke didn't come. She was the only one there for the entire breakfast. After she finished, a maid rushed in to clear the dishes, moving so quickly it seemed as if she were afraid the girl might speak. When she tentatively asked, "Is the butler here?" the maid merely shook her head and hurried out, tray in hand. The entire estate felt like a vast, silent film stage, where everyone was playing their part. No one spoke, no one looked at her. Everyone was deliberately avoiding some unseen presence. She wandered through the estate, holding the cat. On the ground floor, aside from the dining room, there was a reception room, a study, and a ballroom draped in heavy velvet curtains. All the furniture was covered in white cloth, with fine dust floating in the air. It was clear the place hadn't been used in a long time. The second floor was the living area. Both sides of the hallway were lined with tightly closed doors. She tried pushing them, but every single one was locked. The third floor held her bedroom and bathroom. Above that was an attic, but the entrance to the staircase was blocked by an iron gate. She didn't go to the east wing. It wasn't that she didn't want to go. It was that she stopped the moment she reached the entrance to the corridor leading to the east wing. It wasn't because of the butler's warning, but because the atmosphere of that corridor was different from the rest of the estate. The other corridors were merely dark, cold, and oppressive, but the corridor in the east wing exuded a chill that made her hair stand on end, like black water flowing beneath a layer of ice calm on the surface, but a bottomless abyss beneath her feet. She stood at the entrance for a few seconds, then turned and left. It wasn't cowardice. The time simply wasn't right. She needed more information, more leverage, before she could venture into that place. She spent the entire morning wandering the estate, like a fly trapped in a glass bottle, bumping into walls everywhere. No one spoke to her. There was nothing to do, and time dragged on slow and viscous. She tried going to the study to find a book to read, only to discover that while the bookshelves weren't locked, they were filled with local histories of the North, mining manuals, and a genealogy of the Silver Wolf clan thicker than a brick. Not a single page of light reading meant for the living. By noon, she couldn't stand it any longer and decided to visit the garden once more. The orange cat seemed to sense she was leaving. It immediately jumped off the bed and followed close behind her, tail held high, looking every bit the part of a cat about to patrol its territory. She hesitated for a moment, but finally picked it up. After all, the Duke had already seen it yesterday. If he wanted to come, let him. The worst that could happen was getting scolded. It wasn't going to cost her a thing. The garden looked quite different in the daylight. Under the gray, hazy sky, the deep red roses no longer seemed garish. Instead, they possessed a stark, austere beauty. Dewdrops glistened on the petals, and the thorns on the stems reflected a faint light, resembling rows of tiny daggers. The flower wall seemed taller and denser than she remembered from yesterday. The vines clung in layer upon layer to the rust-stained iron trellis, forming an impenetrable barrier of foliage. She approached the flower wall, wanting to see what exactly had frightened her sister so much. A rose is just a rose. The leaves and flowers were all ordinary roses, just a better variety and better cared for. She leaned in close to a deep red rose in full bloom and reached out to touch a petal. "If I were you, I wouldn't touch those flowers." A voice came from behind her. It wasn't the Duke. She spun around abruptly and saw a tall, slender man leaning against a pillar of the stone pavilion, his arms crossed over his chest, eyeing her with a lazy gaze. She had never seen this man before. He looked to be in his early 30s, dressed in a finely tailored dark green hunting coat, his feet clad in mud, splattered riding boots. His auburn hair was toused by the wind, and a faint, ambiguous smile played at the corners of his mouth. His features bore a slight resemblance to the Duke's, the curve of his brow, the line of his jaw. But their demeanors were polar opposites. The Duke was ice. This man was wind, the kind of wind that blows through your hair with a playful, teasing intent. "There's something in the soil at the base of those roses." He straightened up and strolled leisurely toward her, his riding boots making a crisp clicking sound on the flagstones. "A powdered ore native to the north. Mixed into the soil, it makes the rose's colors exceptionally vivid. The downside is, it's poisonous. It causes infection if it touches an open wound, and eating even half a petal can make you vomit and have diarrhea for 3 days." She immediately pulled her hand back. "Thanks for the warning," she said, eyeing the stranger warily. He stepped in front of her, towering over her. He was tall, a full head taller than the Duke. She had to crane her neck to meet his gaze. He tilted his head to look at the yawning orange cat in her arms, and suddenly laughed. "Are you the woman who made Ryan laugh?" he asked. "The butler told me this morning, but to be honest, I didn't really believe it." Raine, the Duke's name. Anyone who could call the Duke by his first name, and in such a casual tone, must be a close relative. "Who are you?" she asked. He dramatically clutched his chest and put on a wounded expression. "I'm hurt. You're marrying into the Silverwolf family, yet you don't even know your future brother-in-law. My name is Callus Silverwolf, your husband's half-brother. Of course, don't let the Silverwolf surname scare you. I'm not like him. I'm actually quite easygoing." He held out his hand, but she hesitated and didn't take it. He didn't seem to mind. He withdrew his hand, slipped it into his pants pocket, and shrugged. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "I live here," Cale said. "The East Wing." Those two words were like a key, clicking open a hidden lock. The East Wing. The butler had said the East Wing was off limits. Last night, the scent of ointment had drifted from the East Wing down the hallway, and her intuition told her the East Wing must be hiding something important. And now, the man standing before her claimed he lived there. She took another look at Callus. The cuffs and hem of his hunting jacket showed clear signs of wear, not from age but from frequent outdoor activity. The mud on his riding boots was still fresh, indicating he'd been out that morning. And since the butler hadn't shown up for breakfast, and the maid refused to speak, she suddenly had a bold theory. "How many people are currently living on the estate?" she asked. Callus tilted his head, as if admiring her sharpness. He didn't answer immediately but walked into the stone pavilion, sat down on a stone bench next to the wheelchair, crossed his legs and pulled a silver flask from his hunting jacket pocket. He unscrewed the cap and took a sip. "Not many," he said, wiping the corner of his mouth with his sleeve. "My brother, me, the butler, 2 maids, a cook, a stable hand. Plus you, that makes 7. Of course, there's that furball in your arms, so make that 8. 7 people. A duke's estate this size, with only 7 people. She'd counted them yesterday as she went upstairs. There were at least 12 rooms on the 3rd floor alone, and every one of them was larger than the one she was currently staying in. An estate capable of housing at least 100 servants now stood empty, with only 7 people remaining, like the skeleton of a giant beast that had been gutted. "Why?" she asked. Callus glanced at her. A fleeting shadow suddenly crossed his eyes that resembled the Duke's in color, but were utterly devoid of warmth. He lowered his crossed leg, leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and said in a tone that was half serious, half joking, "Because no one can stand it. The last servant to last a full year at this estate was back when my mother was still alive. Do you know what the people of the North call this estate?" She shook her head. "Silent Valley," Callus said, enunciating each word. "Not because it's quiet here, but because if you stay too long, people go mad and run out into the world, only to collapse halfway there and never speak again. Their tongues are still there, their mouths are still there, but they can't speak. It's as if something has been torn from their throats." "C.T. I went so." He was clearly smiling as he spoke, but the shadows in his eyes grew darker and darker until they were nearly spilling over. She took a half step back, clutching the cat. It wasn't that she was afraid of him, it was that his words contained far too much to process. She forced herself to piece these fragments together. Poisonous roses, an empty estate, servants gone mad, the forbidden East Wing and the younger brother living there, and a duke in a wheelchair who hadn't smiled in 3 years. This was no simple marriage of convenience. It was a cage for trapped beasts, and everyone was trapped in their own place, waiting for something to either unlock or completely shatter this balance. Cale suddenly stood up, brushed the dust off his trousers, and tucked the flask into his pocket. His expression returned to its earlier cynical ease, as if the brief shadow of darkness from a moment ago had been nothing more than her imagination. "I mean you no harm, sister-in-law," he said, deliberately drawing out the words. Sister-in-law with a familiarity that wasn't off-putting. "To be honest, when I heard the butler say this morning that you made my brother laugh, I nearly rolled out of bed. I haven't seen him smile in 3 years. 3 years. I even thought he'd lost that ability." He walked over to her side and suddenly bent down to whisper in her ear. The movement was so sudden that she instinctively leaned back, but the words he spoke into her ear left her frozen in place. "But you'd better be careful," he said in a voice so low it was almost a whisper, his breath brushing against her earlobe, warm and dangerous. "The last person my brother ever laughed with is now buried beneath the rose trellis in the garden." He straightened up, gave her a wink, then turned and strode off toward the east wing, the hem of his hunting coat fluttering in the wind, leaving a trail of muddy boot prints behind him. She stood rooted to the spot, her heart pounding. The orange cat, its fur bristling without her noticing, let out a low growl and stared in the direction where Callus had vanished. Silence returned to the garden. The roses swayed gently in the breeze. Their deep red petals resembled countless tightly closed lips, guarding the secrets buried beneath the soil. She looked down at the blue flagstones at her feet and suddenly noticed a few tiny white wildflowers growing in the cracks between them, hidden by the shadows of the roses. Impossible to spot without a closer look. She crouched down, parting the lowest leaves of the rosebush, and saw a line of crooked characters carved into the stone. The inscription was faint, as if etched with a sharp stone or fingernail, and was mostly covered by moss and dirt, revealing only half of the text. Dead. There must have been more words before these two, but they had been worn away beyond recognition. She traced the engraved lines with her finger, sensing that the strokes conveyed not only fear, but also a kind of hysterical despair. The person who carved them had used tremendous force, enough to draw blood from their own fingers, to etch those words into the stone. She stood up, feeling her knees go a little weak. The wind suddenly picked up and the rose-covered wall rustled, as if countless voices were whispering in unison. She clutched the cat in her arms and hurried out of the garden. Before leaving, she glanced back at the stone pavilion. The wheelchair the Duke had sat in yesterday was still there, the blanket on his lap fluttering gently in the wind. Only then did she notice that the sapphire eyes of the silver wolf crest on the blanket seemed to be watching her, no matter which angle she looked at it from. After returning to her room, she locked the door from the inside and sat on the edge of the bed for a long while before her heartbeat finally calmed. The orange cat lay on the windowsill, its tail dangling and twitching, its yellow eyes half closed, as if guarding this territory. She began to carefully sort through the information she had. First, there were only 7 people in this estate, and vast amounts of space lay unused, suggesting that something had happened in the past to cause a massive exodus of staff. Second, Callus lived in the East Wing, which was off-limits. These 2 facts could not possibly be unrelated. Third, at least one dead body was buried beneath the rose wall in the garden, if Callus was telling the truth. Fourth, her sister had discovered some part of these secrets before her wedding, and then she had run away. Fifth, and this was the most important point, the Duke himself, that single smile of his in the garden, proved he was not naturally heartless. A crack had already appeared in that wall of stone, and Callus's remark that the one who laughed last is buried beneath the rose wall suggested that the Duke's current coldness was not a matter of character, but the result of some immense trauma. Someone had died beneath the rose wall, and that person had likely once made the Duke laugh, only to meet her end buried beneath the poisonous roses. As this thought crossed her mind, a wave of nausea suddenly churned in her stomach, because yesterday in the garden she had done the very same thing that dead woman had done. She had made the Duke laugh. Would history repeat itself? Would her fate also become a line of carvings beneath the rose wall? A knock sounded suddenly. She jumped to her feet, her heart nearly leaping out of her throat. The orange cat also leaped down from the windowsill and scurried under the bed, leaving only a pair of glowing eyes visible. "Madam," the butler's voice came from outside the door. "His Grace the Duke requests your presence in the study immediately." She took a deep breath, smoothed her collar and hair in the mirror, and tugged the hem of her dress up slightly. Her reflection looked a little pale, but her gaze remained steely. She opened the door to find the butler standing there, holding a tray with a neatly folded navy blue gown. "Put this on," the butler said. "His Grace is waiting for you in the study. He has something to say to you." She put on the dress. The fit was perfect. The waistline was spot on, the cuffs were just right, as if it had been tailored to her exact measurements. Yet the butler had clearly said just yesterday that a maid would come to take her measurements today. She looked at herself in the mirror. The deep blue skirt fell to her ankles, and the neckline was embroidered with a fine circle of silver patterns. Not roses, not silver wolves, but a plant she didn't recognize, with long, slender leaves like swords. "What kind of flower is this?" she asked the butler, as he smoothed out the hem of her skirt. The butler looked up and glanced at her reflection in the mirror. Something flickered and vanished in his aged eyes. "It is not a flower," he said, "but a thorn." Then he took a step back and made a gesture of invitation. "The master is waiting for you, madam. Please follow me." She followed the butler down the long corridor, her footsteps echoing hollowly on the stone floor. It was no longer practical to carry the cat in her arms, so she had left the orange cat in the room. The little creature poked half its head out from under the bed and watched her leave with its yellow eyes, a look of genuine concern in its gaze. A cat's concern, she thought with a wry smile. Even the cat had sensed the danger before she had. The study lay at the end of the second-floor corridor, marked by a pair of double oak doors. The door handles were carved with two silver wolves facing off, their eyes set with sapphires matching those on the rug. The butler opened the door for her but stepped back, remaining outside instead of following her in. The moment she took her first step into the study, the door behind her closed softly with a click as the bolt slid into the lock. This study was larger than any room she had ever seen. The vaulted ceiling was adorned with a massive mural depicting the first Duke of the North slaying a direwolf on the snowy plains. The paint had darkened slightly with age, and the dying direwolf's eyes glowed a deep red, as if gazing down upon everyone who entered the room. Bookshelves lined all four walls from floor to ceiling, crammed to the brim with books. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, leather, and a faint whiff of cedar. The Duke sat behind a massive oak desk in the center of the study. He was not in a wheelchair, but seated in a specially modified high-backed chair, with a metal brace on either side of the armrests to support his upper body and keep him upright. Today he wore a black high-collared shirt, buttoned all the way up, with silver cufflinks engraved with a wolf's head at the cuffs. His hair appeared darker than it had in the garden yesterday, almost jet black, and was neatly combed back, revealing a face with features so sharply defined they seemed almost unreal. A pile of documents lay spread across the desk. To his left sat a cup of red tea that no longer gave off steam, and to his right stood a brass desk lamp, its shade gathering the light into a circle that illuminated a letter before him. The paper was a deep beige, its edges gilded. The wax seal had been broken, and imprinted on the dark red wax was a coat of arms she didn't recognize. Not a silver wolf, but a coiled snake holding a rose in its mouth. She stood before the desk, unsure whether to sit down or speak. The rules from her sister's manuscript buzzed in her head. Never look the master in the eye, never make a sound in the hallway. But she had already broken every one of them yesterday. What was the point of following them now? She simply lifted her head and met his gaze directly. His deep gray eyes were looking at her too. Not scrutinizing, not examining, but something more complex. Like someone looking at a wall that had suddenly cracked open, wanting both to repair it and to see what light was seeping in through the fissure. "Sit," he said. She sat down in the chair opposite him. The seat was hard, and the carved patterns on the backrest dug into her spine. She forced herself to sit up straight, folded her hands in her lap, and tried her best to look less nervous. "Kales went to see you," he said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. "Yes," she replied, without adding a word. "What did he say?" She hesitated for 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, countless thoughts raced through her mind. Should she be honest or hold something back? The words Callus had spoken, about the people buried beneath the rose wall, about the fate of the one who had finally made the Duke laugh. Should she reveal everything? She looked into the Duke's bottomless eyes and suddenly realized he wasn't asking, "What did Callus tell you?" He was asking a deeper question, how much you learned in the garden, and what you intend to do with that information. He told me not to touch the roses. She chose to reveal only part of the truth. He said there's poisonous ore powder in the soil around the roots. He also said he lives in the East Wing, and there are only 7 people left in this estate now. The Duke's expression remained unchanged, but his hand moved. His right index finger tapped the tabletop ever so lightly, just once, then stopped. This tiny gesture betrayed a flicker of emotion within him, greater than she had anticipated. "And?" he asked. She took a deep breath and decided to lay her cards on the table. "He also said that the last person to make you laugh is now buried beneath the rose trellis." Silence. The study was so quiet she could hear the faint hum of the filament in the desk lamp. The Duke did not move. There was no anger, no protest, not even a flicker in his eyes. He simply sat there, bathed in that dim, yellow light, enveloping her words in a silence longer than a winter in the north. Then he did something she had not anticipated at all. He pushed the letter in front of him toward her. The envelope slid across the desk and came to rest within her reach. She glanced down at it. The coat of arms, a snake clutching a rose, glowed a dull gold in the light, its eyes set with tiny rubies that shone faintly. "Open it," he said. She picked up the envelope and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. The paper was thin and translucent, with a few lines written in an exquisitely neat, courtly hand. Her eyes scanned the text, and with every line she read, her heart sank a little further. The letter was addressed to His Grace, Lord Raine Silverwolf, Duke of the North, and signed the Steward of the Eyrie, on behalf of His Grace, the Earl. The content was brief, stating that the Earl of Wester, the man her sister was meant to marry, expressed deep regret over the Duke of the North's abrupt annulment of the betrothal. It went on to express the hope that His Grace the Duke would reconsider the agreement between the 2 houses, noting that once a marriage contract is signed, it is binding under the witness of the gods. Finally, it added, Lord Heston has also expressed concern regarding this matter. She read the very last word, folded the paper back into the envelope, and pushed it back across the desk. Her fingers were trembling, but she managed to keep the tremors from spreading above her wrists. She wasn't frightened by the letter's contents, but rather stunned by the implications it revealed. Her sister's flight was more than just a flight. Behind this marriage lay more than just the mining deal between her father and the Duke. There was a third party involved, the Earl of West, as well as the Lord Heston mentioned in the letter. The Duke had intercepted a betrothal that should have belonged to West, and West was dissatisfied, even bringing in someone of higher standing to exert pressure. This meant that from the very beginning, this marriage had not been a matter between just 2 families, but a power struggle involving 3, 4, or even more factions. And she, this last-minute substitute thrust into the engagement, had unwittingly become the focal point of the entire chess game. "Why did the Earl of West want to marry my sister?" she asked, her voice far calmer than she had expected. The Duke tilted his head slightly. The light cast a line of shadow across his face, leaving half his expression in light and half in shadow, unreadable and inscrutable. "Your sister's dowry includes a piece of land," he said. "Beneath that land lies a silver vein with reserves sufficient to supply the kingdom's mint for 20 years. Did your father not tell you?" Her father had told her nothing. She didn't even know her sister owned a piece of land. She had known since childhood that her family was not poor. Her father was the lord of a viscountcy in the south, with estates, mines, and tenant farmers. They lived comfortably, though they could hardly be called wealthy. But a silver vein capable of supplying the kingdom's mint for 20 years. That wasn't merely wealth. It was a fortune sufficient to alter the entire power structure of the South. If her sister married into the House of Wester, with that land, the Earl of Wester's influence would swell to a point where it could threaten the North. Conversely, if her sister married the Duke of the North, the silver vein would fall into the hands of the Silverwolf family. The North's already formidable military might, coupled with such vast wealth, would leave Wester and the forces behind it with no chance of a comeback. So this was not a mere marriage of convenience. It was a war without gunpowder, where every participant used marriage as a weapon, women as pawns, and land and mineral veins as stakes. My sister saw through this, which is why she fled. And what of her? She had nothing. No silver mines, no dowry. Not even her name was her own. In this game of chess, she wasn't even a piece. At best, she was a scratch on the board. A mistake, a variable so small it could be ignored. But yesterday, that variable made the Duke smile. "Now you know where you stand," the Duke said. There was neither sympathy nor sarcasm in his voice, only a pure, emotionless statement. "You have no dowry, no family backing, no political value. By the normal logic of aristocratic marriages, you should have been sent back within the first hour of arriving at the estate. But you didn't send me back," she said. "Because I have no need for your political value," he said, his gaze shifting from her face to the cup of completely cold red tea on the desk, its surface covered with a thin film that reflected the dim yellow light of the lamp. "What I need is something else." She didn't press him to explain what that something else was. She had a gut feeling that asking wouldn't yield an answer, at least not now. This man kept all his secrets locked beneath layer upon layer of ice. Yesterday in the garden, she had merely chiseled open a crack by chance. It didn't mean she could step inside, but there was one other thing she needed to know. "The person buried beneath the rose wall," she began, her voice so soft it was nearly swallowed by the dying giant wolf in the ceiling fresco. "Who is it?" The Duke's hand froze. Not just his fingers, but his entire hand. He had been reaching for the cup of lukewarm tea, his hand suspended midair, knuckles slightly bent, and then it simply froze there. The stillness lasted less than a second, but to Serena that second felt stretched out into an entire winter. She could feel the air grow heavy in that instant, so heavy it pressed down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. Then his hand dropped, not to touch the teacup, but to rest on the armrest of the wheelchair. His knuckles tightened, and the blue veins on the back of his hand bulged out like tiny rivers. "My mother." Those two words were squeezed out from between his teeth. It wasn't a tone of sadness, but a calmness, one that had been suppressed for far too long, bordering on rage. He lifted his head to look at her again. In those deep gray eyes, the frozen soil had cracked open in more than one place, and beneath the fissures, she saw not sorrow, not pain, but a searing magma like rage. That rage had been frozen for so long that on the surface it looked no different from ice, yet it had never ceased to burn. "Her name was Elena Silverwolf," he said, each word as if chiseled from a tombstone. "The former Duchess of the North. During the rebellion 3 years ago, she was taken from this estate and brought south, where she was tortured for 11 full days before her execution." He paused. The light from the desk lamp flickered suddenly, as if the voltage had dropped, and the shadows throughout the study trembled in unison. "After the rebellion ended, I recovered only a portion of her ashes. I mixed them into the soil of the garden and planted that wall of roses. The powdered toxic ore wasn't meant to nurture the roses. It was meant to ensure no one dared approach her grave." He leaned back in his chair, the two metal struts emitting a faint creak. He looked at Serena, his gaze like two knives freshly drawn from the fire, so searing she almost wanted to look away. But she didn't. She forced herself to meet that gaze, to meet the secret he hadn't shared with anyone in 3 years. "Kales told you that the last person to make me laugh is buried beneath the flower wall." The Duke's mouth curved slightly. Not a smile, but a line twisted by pain. "He was wrong. My mother made me laugh many times. She cared for me throughout my childhood, and after my father died in battle, she held up the North single-handedly. Her last words before her execution were, 'Tell Ryan, do not let a Southerner's footprint touch the soil of the North.'" He paused, his gaze softening for an instant. Just a moment, like a knife hovering for a second before it falls. And then, I married you, a woman from the south. As those words fell, Serena felt the entire study tremble. It wasn't because she grasped the contradiction behind them. A woman who had sworn never to let a Southerner set foot in the North, yet whose son had married a Southern bride. But because she finally understood why he had laughed in the garden yesterday, and why, in that very instant of laughter, he had suddenly withdrawn. All warmth. He wasn't laughing at her joke. He was laughing at the absurdity of fate. The dying wish his mother had left with her life. He had shattered with his own hands, 3 years later through a political marriage. That orange cat, that clumsy joke, had merely given him a nudge, allowing him to see in that instant just how ridiculous he was. She opened her mouth, wanting to say something, but her throat felt as if it were blocked by something. Words of comfort felt too shallow, words of sympathy too hollow, and silence too cruel. In the end, she said nothing. She simply reached out and placed her hand over the back of his cold hand resting on the table. His fingers curled sharply, as if he'd been burned. She thought he would pull his hand away, but he didn't. He remained frozen there, letting her palm rest against the back of his hand, the warmth from her skin slowly seeping into his joints, seeping into those bones deformed by years of gripping a sword and using a wheelchair. The light from the desk lamp fell on the two hands resting together, one pale and slender, with distinct knuckles, as if carved from marble, the other a size smaller, its skin the pale honey hue of someone tanned by southern sun, with nails trimmed short looking clean and sturdy. This was their first, true, physical contact. Not a gaze exchanged through a curtain of rain, nor a scrutinizing look through a blanket, but skin against skin, warmth passing from one to the other. His hand was cold, as if just pulled from icy water. Those bones trembled slightly beneath her palm, not from the cold, but because no one had touched him for far too long. 3 years, over 1,000 days. This man had not been embraced, had not had his hand held, had not felt any physical contact devoid of purpose. Every touch had been to help him move his wheelchair, adjust his clothes, or examine his numb legs. No one had ever touched him simply because they wanted to. She was the first. The butler cleared his throat outside the door. The two people in the study withdrew their hands simultaneously, their movements as synchronized as if rehearsed. The Duke resumed his cold, stern demeanor, his back straight, his jaw set, sealing every crack in an instant. But Serena saw it, in that split second, as he withdrew his hand. His index finger curved slightly, as if trying to grasp her fingertip, only to stop abruptly midway. "My lord," the butler's voice came from outside the door, tinged with an unusual tension. "Lord Heston's envoy has arrived. He says it is urgent and must see you immediately." The Duke's expression turned utterly icy the moment he heard the name Heston. It was not the restrained coldness of before, but a cruelty bordering on murderous intent. His pupils contracted slightly, and the rhythm of his breathing shifted ever so slightly. Inhalations grew shorter, exhalations longer, the kind of breathing pattern one would expect from a warrior on the battlefield, just before drawing his sword. "Have him wait in the reception room," the Duke said, his voice thin and sharp as a blade. He pushed himself up from the desk, or more accurately, used the strength of his arms to lift himself from the chair, and then, with an extremely practiced movement, transferred to the wheelchair beside him. The entire process was smooth and swift, clearly one he had repeated countless times. But after he sat down in the wheelchair, there was a moment of stillness. His hands rested on his knees, his head bowed, his dark hair falling over his eyes. Serena saw his lips move silently. She couldn't make out the words, but she could feel the warmth of the word. For the moment it fell, his entire body sank slightly, like a tower swaying in an earthquake before bracing itself firmly once more. Then he raised his head, resuming the expression she'd first seen in the garden, cold, distant, like a boulder weathered by the winds and snows of the north for 1,000 years. "Go back to your room," he told her, Not a suggestion, not an order, but a tone somewhere in between, tinged with a barely perceptible tension. Go back now. Don't come out. Don't go downstairs, and no matter what sounds you hear, don't open the door. Remember, don't let the envoy see you. She stood up and walked toward the door. As she passed his wheelchair, she paused, lowered her head, and spoke in a voice only he could hear. I won't run. No matter what happens, I won't run. She didn't wait for his reply. She pulled open the study door and walked out. The butler was waiting for her outside, his face etched with anxiety, the wrinkles on his forehead twice as deep as they had been yesterday. He handed her a brass key engraved with her room number. Lock the door, ma'am, the old butler said, his lips trembling. Please make sure you lock the door. She took the key and hurried toward the stairs. The orange cat was waiting for her at the landing on the 3rd floor. As soon as it saw her coming up, it meowed and rubbed against her, its tail circling her ankles. She bent down to pick it up, opened the door to her room, went inside, locked it from the inside, and turned the key in the lock one extra time. Then she walked to the window and peered out through a gap in the curtains. A black carriage was parked outside the estate gates. The body of the carriage was trimmed with gold, and the doors bore a coat of arms she didn't recognize. Not the snake and rose from the letter, but a soaring eagle clutching a broken sword in its talons. 4 guards on black horses stood around the carriage, all dressed in deep red uniforms, with sword hilts at their waists, inlaid with the exact same eagle motif as the carriage. An envoy from a count. His entourage was more imposing than that of a duke. This in itself was a humiliation. She looked toward the reception room. The curtains were drawn, and she could not see inside. But she could sense a stifling tension, like a storm gathering on the horizon. That oppressive atmosphere spread from the 1st floor to the 3rd, seeping through the walls, floors, and the cracks in the tightly shut doors, silently engulfing everything like a rising tide. The orange cat squirmed restlessly in her arms, letting out a low, muffled growl. Animals' instincts are often keener than humans. This cat hadn't been afraid of the Duke himself yesterday, yet now it was making threatening sounds toward the unseen guest downstairs. She sat down on the edge of the bed, placed the cat on her lap, and stroked its back intermittently. Her mind was racing. Lord Heston. That name had appeared when the Duke saw the letter, and now he had sent an envoy directly to the door. In the letter he had been presented as a backer by the Earl of Wester, but now he was intervening directly. This could only mean one thing. They had discovered some new variable, one significant enough to make them bypass diplomatic niceties and apply direct pressure. This variable, needless to say, was herself. The fact that she had married the Duke was not important in itself. What mattered was that she had taken her sister's place, and her sister had fled with the silver vein. West and Heston's original plan was to seize the silver mine through this marriage. Now that their scheme has fallen through, they will naturally investigate who thwarted their plans. They will trace it back to her father, to her sister's disappearance, and to her, the stand-in bride. Then they will realize that the crux of the problem lies not in the south, but in the north, in the bride who should never have been by the side of this crippled Duke. She was the evidence, the living proof, the only uncontrollable variable in this game of power. Her very existence proved that the marriage had a flaw sufficient to serve as an excuse to annul the contract. Annulling the contract would allow for the redistribution of the silver veins, or even the direct initiation of armed conflict. That was why the Duke had instructed the envoy not to see her. He was protecting her. This realization struck her like a blunt blow to the chest. Just yesterday, she had thought of herself as nothing more than a disposable pawn that could be sent back at any moment. Today, she realized she had become the most critical piece on this chessboard, not because of her status or her worth, but because her very existence was enough to alter the entire situation. And the Duke had chosen to protect her. The sound of hooves came from outside the window. Peering through the gap in the curtains, She saw the black carriage driving away from the estate, followed closely by 4 guards, their hooves tapping out a rapid, fading rhythm on the cobblestones. The envoy had stayed for less than 20 minutes. This speed meant either the negotiations had been extremely unpleasant, or that the Duke hadn't given him a chance to speak at all. She waited about 5 minutes, making sure the carriage was well out of sight, before unlocking the door and stepping out of the room. The hallway was empty, but a figure stood at the top of the stairs. Not the butler, but Callus. He was leaning against the banister, twirling a sheathed dagger between his fingers. The scabbard danced at his fingertips, and the silver hilt cast flecks of light in the dim corridor. When he saw her emerge, his movement stopped and he sheathed the dagger at his back. "Has the envoy left?" she asked. "He's gone," Callus said. His expression was grim. The usual carefree, laid-back air had vanished, replaced by a tense alertness. "My brother saw him out, though saw isn't quite the right word. More accurately, my brother told the envoy that if he didn't show up at the estate gates within 30 seconds, the torture apparatus in the East Wing cellar, which had been gathering dust for 3 years, would be put back into use." She gasped. Threatening an envoy with torture wasn't just a diplomatic spat. It was a blatant declaration of war. "Heston won't let this go." Callus stepped in front of her, looking down at her with a rare seriousness in his eyes. "Have you ever wondered why my brother went to marry your sister, and not me? I'm unmarried younger than him, and my legs are perfectly fine. By any normal logic, I should have been the more suitable choice for the marriage." She had indeed pondered this question. From the very beginning, it had felt wrong. A crippled duke, rumored to have a temper so violent that no one could tolerate him, versus a healthy, handsome younger brother. Any normal family would choose the younger brother, because the Silver Wolf family needs an heir. Callus answered his own question, a strange bitterness in his tone. "And I cannot have children." The words echoed briefly in the empty corridor before being swallowed by the walls. "That rebellion 3 years ago," he continued, his gaze shifting to the stained glass window at the end of the corridor, where the light cast his profile, half in red, half in shadow. "When the rebels stormed the estate, I was in the East Wing. They forced a poison down my throat. Not enough to kill me, but enough to destroy my ability to, as the nobles put it, procreate. My brother survived because he took the most fatal blow for me, damaging his spine and crippling his legs. The rebels only retreated because they thought he was dead." His voice was calm, as if he were recounting someone else's story. But Serena saw his Adam's apple bob violently, as if he were swallowing these words and spitting them back out, each one carrying the bitter taste of stomach acid. "You don't know this isn't your fault," Callus said. "There are no more than 5 people in the entire kingdom who know this secret. Heston is one of them, because he was the one who funded the rebels back then. He wanted to swallow up the North by destroying the Silverwolf bloodline, first by poisoning me into disability, then by killing my brother. Only he didn't succeed back then, and now my brother sits here in this manner, living longer than he ever anticipated. That's why he's in such a hurry. He needs to siphon off the North's resources, bit by bit, before the Silverwolf line is completely extinguished. The marriage alliance is his weapon." He placed his hand on her shoulder. The touch was light, but his palm was hot. Even through the fabric, she could feel the nearly scorching heat. That warmth stood in eerie contrast to the icy facts spilling from his mouth. "So do you understand now?" He looked down into her eyes. "You're not just marrying a cripple, not just the eccentric duke. You're marrying Heston's thorn in the side, the thorn the entire southern nobility wants to pull out. You made my brother laugh in the garden yesterday. Do you know what that means? It means you've become his weakness. In this world, weaknesses get targeted." She looked up at him, neither backing away nor lowering her gaze. Her eyes shone unnaturally bright in the dim corridor, like 2 stars driven to the brink of extinction. "Then, what can I do?" she asked. Callus froze. He had clearly expected her to be afraid, to cry, to ask him if he could send her back to the south. But what she asked was, "What can I do?" Those 3 words were like a pair of scissors, cutting through all the comforting words he had prepared. He stared at her for a long time, then smiled. Not his usual flippant smile, but a genuine one, the kind you give when you see something rare. "I'm starting to understand why my brother smiled at you." He released her shoulders and took a step back. "All right, since you want to do something, I'll tell you one thing you can do. Tomorrow a man will arrive at the estate. His name is Orlando. He's a circuit judge from the south, and also the head of Heston's intelligence network in the north. He'll be visiting under the pretext of checking in on the Silverwolf family. But in reality, he's here to confirm your existence, gather enough intelligence, and prepare for the next move." "What do I need to do?" she repeated. "You need to ensure he doesn't see a flustered country viscount's daughter, who's been sent as a substitute bride," Callus said, enunciating each word clearly, "but a true Duchess of the North." At the end of the corridor, the butler suddenly appeared. His face was paler than usual, and he held a silver tray bearing an unsealed letter. The paper was pitch black, its edges singed, leaving a ring of irregular scorch marks. "My lady," the butler said, his voice so soft it was barely audible, "this was left by the envoy, for you." She took the letter. On the black paper was a single line, written in silver ink, the handwriting as sharp as a knife's edge scraping across the paper. "Bride of the Silver Wolf, welcome to the North. You are the most beautiful accident in the plan. We shall meet again." She turned the paper over. The back was blank, save for those 2 scorch marks, which glowed a faint reddish hue under the lamp, like the charred remains of a name that had been burned away. H. Echton Halloway, the most powerful Earl in the South, the financier of the rebellion 3 years ago, the architect of the plan to destroy the Silverwolf family. He had written her a welcome letter, not to the Duke, not to the Silverwolf family, but to her. The orange cat had slipped out of the room at some point, crouching at her feet and tilting its head up to look at the black sheet of paper. It let out a shrill, drawn-out cry she had never heard before. Not a threat, not fear, but a sound bordering on grief that she could not decipher. Cales frowned as he looked at the cat, then glanced at the letter in her hand. "Did you find that cat in the garden?" he asked suddenly. She nodded. Cales's expression changed. He crouched down, staring at the orange cat, and reached out to part the fur on its neck. Where the collar had sat, the fur was noticeably shorter than elsewhere, and a faint, smooth indentation was visible on the skin, the mark left by a long, worn collar. "This isn't a stray," Callus said, standing up, his voice tight. "This cat was kept by someone, and for a long time. The collar was removed only recently." He met Serena's gaze, those eyes similar in color to his brother's, but with a completely different warmth, were now filled with something bordering on fear. 3 years ago, someone at the Duke's manor in the north kept an orange cat, he said. That person was my mother. The roses in the garden swayed silently in the night breeze. A solitary lamp glowed in a window of the east wing in the distance, flickering in the breeze like an eye that refused to close. The silver ink on the black letter was dampened by sweat in her palm. The ink slightly smudged. The final stroke of the signature was drawn out long and sharp, like a stretched-out cold sneer. H. The chill that seeped through her fingers from that signature made her truly understand, for the first time, what the butler had said, that in this estate any change is dangerous. And from the moment she stepped into the garden, she had already overturned the entire chessboard. The cat crouched at her feet, tilting its head to look up at the black letter in her hand. The reflection of the silver script shone in its yellow eyes, like 2 cursed pieces of amber. Callus crouched before the orange cat, his fingers still hovering near its neck, not yet withdrawn. His Adam's apple bobbed once, his lips pressed into a pale line. The face that usually wore a mocking smile was now taut as a drumhead. "Are you sure?" Serena asked. her voice barely a whisper, not for fear of being overheard by others, but by the manor itself. Those walls, those portraits, those sealed doors, all had grown ears in the silence, I'm sure. Callus stood up and brushed imaginary dust from his knees, a gesture clearly meant to buy time to gather his thoughts. My mother had an orange cat named Spark. Its coat was exactly like yours, a deep orange base with a diamond-shaped white patch on its belly. I haven't seen it in 3 years. I thought it had died long ago. Serena looked down at the cat in her arms. There was indeed a white patch on its belly, diamond, shaped with jagged edges, like a torn-up map. When she'd found it in the rain yesterday, it had been so thin its ribs were sticking out, its fur matted in clumps, and it was soaked through. It didn't look at all like a house cat that had been cared for, but the marks from a collar were real, and so was that fearless, clingy nature. A stray cat wouldn't burrow into someone's arms the moment they met. It had been raised by someone, held by someone, loved by someone. A cat that had belonged to a duchess who died 3 years ago. On the very first day she'd married into the estate, it had dashed through the pouring rain into the forbidden garden and collided with her legs. She didn't believe it was a coincidence. The orange cat Spark peered out from her arms, glanced toward the east wing, and twitched its ears, as if hearing a sound only it could hear. Then it curled back into her lap, burying its fluffy head in the crook of her elbow and letting out a low, almost sighing purr. The east wing, Serena said suddenly. You live in the east wing. Was your mother's room in the east wing too? Callus was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. Her room is always locked. My brother doesn't let anyone in, not even me. He paused, pulled the silver flask from his hunting jacket pocket, unscrewed the cap, took a big gulp, and wiped the corner of his mouth with his sleeve. But every now and then, in the middle of the night, I hear a sound coming from behind that door. Not a mouse, not the wind. It's a cat's meow, a very faint, faint meow. I thought I was imagining it. After all, it's only natural for someone who's been poisoned to have their mind play tricks on them. When he said the words, being poisoned, the forced ease on his face finally cracked. Beneath that crack lay not pain, but something colder and harder, buried deeper than pain, looking more like hatred. The kind of hatred that had been bottled up for 3 years, fermenting into a thick, corrosive acid. If my mother had kept this cat for 3 years, if the cat had always stayed in the east wing, if there really were sounds coming from behind that door, Serena said, piecing these fragments together in her mind into an increasingly clear picture, then it's not just about the cat. Callus, was there anything unusual about your mother during the last days of her life? Just as Callus was about to speak, the sound of a wheelchair scraping across the floor suddenly echoed from the other end of the hallway. It wasn't the usual slow, heavy creaking, but a much more urgent, rapid rhythm, as if the wheels were practically grinding against the floor as they raced forward. In less than 5 seconds, the Duke's figure appeared around the corner of the hallway. Behind him followed the old butler, carrying the same silver tray from earlier. The black letter had been removed, leaving only an empty tray. The Duke's eyes locked onto the cat in Serena's arms the very first second. It wasn't his usual detached scrutiny, but a look as if something had struck him right in the heart. His pupils contracted sharply, his lips pressed into a line almost devoid of color, and the hand resting on the wheelchair's armrest clenched violently, his knuckles turning white, as if they were about to pierce his skin. He recognized this cat. No words were needed, no confirmation required. Serena could tell from the look on his face. He had recognized Spark. Perhaps he had recognized it yesterday in the garden, but the rain had been too heavy, the light too dim, and she had been soaked to the bone. All his attention had been drawn to her offhand, half-joking remark, leaving him no time to examine the cat in her arms closely. But now he saw clearly that deep orange fur, that diamond-shaped white patch, those golden eyes. 3 years had passed, and the cat was still alive, having lived silently for 3 years in the estate, where he believed it had long since perished alongside his mother. "Give me the cat." When the Duke uttered those 4 words, his voice wasn't as cold as usual. It wasn't because the temperature had risen, but because what had been suppressed beneath the ice was surging upward, cracking the surface. The force was so immense that he had to contain it within those 4 brief words. One more word and it would shatter. Serena didn't hesitate. She walked over and handed the cat to him. She didn't think he would harm the cat. A man who mixed his mother's ashes into the soil to plant roses would not harm the cat his mother left behind. The way the Duke took the cat left her completely stunned. The way he took the cat was different from how he took anything else. Not with one hand, but with both, gently lifting the cat from her arms as if cradling something extremely fragile. The orange cat named Spark settled into his arms. First, it sniffed his shirt sleeve warily, then stuck out its tongue to lick the silver cufflink on his wrist. Finally, it curled itself into a tight ball and nestled securely into the blanket on his lap, moving with a practiced ease as if it had done this 1,000 times. Because it had indeed done it 1,000 times. 3 years ago, or perhaps even earlier, when his mother was still alive, and he hadn't yet been confined to a wheelchair, this cat must have curled up in his lap just like this. His mother sat across from him, smiling. The roses in the garden hadn't yet been planted. The door to the east wing still stood open, and this estate was still a place where living people resided. Now, only the cat remained. The Duke lowered his head to look at the cat in his lap, his hand resting on its back, his knuckles trembling slightly. It was the kind of tremor that took every ounce of his strength to suppress. So slight it was almost imperceptible, yet his entire body was straining. His shoulders tensed, his spine stiffened, and even his useless, numb legs seemed to tighten under the impulse of muscle memory. "Albert," he said, his voice as rough as if it had been sanded down with sandpaper. The old butler immediately stepped forward. "My lord, go to the east wing. Open the door to my mother's room." The butler's face went pale in an instant. The old wrinkled face seemed to have had all the color drained from it, turning as white as the backgrounds of the portraits lining the manor's corridors. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then swallowed his words. Finally, he merely bowed deeply, uttered a single yes, and turned to walk toward the east wing. His steps were not as brisk as usual. Each one felt as though he were treading on his own hesitation. Callus caught up and walked alongside him. The 2 of them turned at the end of the hallway into the passage leading to the east wing. Serena remained where she was, watching the Duke in his wheelchair, holding the cat, unsure whether she should follow. He made the decision for her. "You come too." 3 words, but she heard a different meaning in them. When he first saw her in the garden yesterday, all he'd said was, "Throw it out. Don't tell me. It's all the same." Words that pushed people away, kept them at a distance, and dragged them toward the door. But now he was saying, "You come too." It wasn't a command, it was an opening. A tiny, tiny opening. But he'd pushed the door ajar, letting her see inside. She followed behind the wheelchair, walking down the corridor leading to the east wing, the one she hadn't ventured into during the day. This corridor was completely different from the west wing. There were no portraits on the walls. Instead, there was a row of candlesticks covered in white cloth, the wax solidified on the holders, untouched for who knows how many years. The bitter, pungent smell of ointment in the air grew stronger, so strong it made her throat tighten. Every door on both sides of the corridor was tightly shut, with strips of old cloth stuffed into the cracks. Whether to keep out the draft or to seal in the odor, she couldn't tell. At the end of the corridor stood a door larger than the others, painted a deep green with a band of rose vines carved around the frame. The butler was already standing before it, holding an iron key 3 times the size of an ordinary one. The metal around the keyhole had developed a thin layer of rust from years of disuse. He inserted the key into the lock and turned his wrist 3 times. Each turn produced a dull, clicking echo, as if 3 locks behind the door were simultaneously resisting the key's intrusion. With the final click, the door swung open. A musty odor poured out from the crack. Air that had been trapped for too long carried a heavy, moldy scent and another, fainter, more unsettling note, like the lingering fragrance of withered flowers or the residue of some ointment dried out by time. The Duke pushed his wheelchair through the door first. Serena followed behind him, and the moment she crossed the threshold, she felt the texture of the floor change, from stone slabs to thick carpet. The carpet had been trodden upon for so long that its original color and pattern were no longer discernible, leaving only a well-worn path from the doorway to the bed, where all the pile had been worn flat. The room was large, about the same size as the Duke's study, but the furnishings were entirely different. It lacked the cold, imposing air of the Duke's style. Rather, it was a place where a woman had once lived. Faded pale yellow bed curtains hung from the bedposts, and the mirror on the dressing table was covered in a layer of dust. Blush boxes and perfume bottles stood in neat rows, their silver-engraved lids oxidized to a dull black. The bookshelves were packed with books, not just the flower guides and collections of love poetry, typically read by noblewomen, but also military histories of the North, treatises on mineralogy, and a handwritten notebook lying open on the desk. The inkwell beside it had long since dried up, and the ink on the nib of the pen had congealed into a dark brown crust. But what sent the greatest chill down her spine was the wall in the very center of the room. Pinned to the wall was a massive map of the kingdom, covered in markings drawn with deep red ink, not random scribbles, but extremely precise military markings. The Silver Wolf clan's territory was circled in blue to the north, while the spheres of influence of the Westers, the Hestons, and several other great noble houses were marked in gray to the south. The central area was densely crisscrossed with arrows, some pointing north, others south, interweaving like a spiderweb that had been torn apart and sewn back together. This map depicted the strategic layout of the war 3 years prior. The former Duchess had not been waiting in despair for rescue as she lay dying. She had been planning a counterattack. Before she was taken by the rebels, she had sat in this very room, staring at this map, drawing each arrow stroke by stroke, mapping out every step to defend the north and repel the invasion from the south. And when Heston's men burst in, she did not even attempt to flee. The Duke paused at his mother's bedside, holding the cat in his arms as he gazed at the map. His profile froze into a statue in the dim light. All emotion was sealed beneath that mask of detachment, save for the thumb of the hand resting on the cat's back, gently stroking its fur stroke by stroke. The gesture was so tender, so out of place in the atmosphere of the room, so tender it brought a lump to Selena's throat. She never let me know what she was doing, even until her dying day, the Duke said, not to anyone in particular, but to the map. A week before the rebellion broke out, she sent me away. She said there had been a cave-in at the mines in the south, and that she needed me to handle it personally. The night I left, she stood at the manor gates to see me off, wearing a deep blue cloak, and told me. He paused. His Adam's apple bobbed. Then he continued, his voice growing lower and hoarser. She told me, Raine, no matter what happens, don't come back. Wait for my letters. By the time I received the 3rd letter, the rebels had already breached the manor. Her 3rd letter contained only 4 words, hold the north. He turned to look at Selena, his deep gray eyes reflecting the dense network of red arrows on the map, as if magma surging beneath the permafrost had finally burned through the ice. I held it. I drove the rebels back south, leaving not a single one behind. Then I returned here to find that everything she'd left behind had been cleared away, save for a patch of roses in the garden. Callus escaped with his life, but was crippled. The butler couldn't recall what exactly happened that night. No one could. Every witness was dead, and the only thing left was a note that read, "Do not enter the east wing." He pulled a yellowed, 4-folded slip of paper from a compartment on the side of his wheelchair, unfolded it, and revealed the woman's slender, hurried handwriting. The ink had faded to a pale brown, but the 4 words were still legible. "Do not enter the East Wing." So I sealed off the East Wing. I locked her room and didn't let anyone in. Not even myself. I kept her dying wish for 3 whole years, until you showed up. He looked at Serena with an expression she had never seen before. It wasn't anger, nor wariness, nor the resigned amusement of yesterday, but a more raw honesty, the kind that comes after being battered by fate until one is utterly spent. "I should have thrown you out yesterday when you crouched down in the garden to hold that cat. Do you know why I didn't?" He moved his hand from the cat's back to rest on the arm of his wheelchair, his knuckles tightening. Suddenly, he seemed both incredibly vulnerable and incredibly dangerous, like a sword heated red, hot over a fire. "Because the way you crouched down was exactly like her. In her lifetime, she loved picking up stray cats in the garden and bringing every single one to the East Wing. The moment you looked up, I almost thought..." He didn't finish, but Serena understood. He hadn't spoken the name, yet it hung in the air between them, like an invisible spider's thread, pulling 2 people separated by 3 years together. The butler cleared his throat softly outside the door. Unsure whether he should enter, he stood on the threshold, still clutching the large iron key in his hand, his expression a mixture of fear and some indescribable emotion. "My lord," he said, "the lady's dressing table drawer is locked. Do you have the key?" The Duke pulled a thin silver chain from his collar. At its end hung a tiny, exquisitely crafted brass key, clearly one he had worn close to his body for many years. He held the key as if it were a red-hot coal, the skin on his fingertips turning pale and bluish from the force of his grip. "You come," he said to Serena. She walked over and took the key from his hand. Their fingers touched briefly. His hand was still cold, but this time it wasn't the chill of an ice cellar. Rather, the coolness of a river just before it thaws, ready to flow. She inserted the key into the lock of the dressing table drawer, turned it once, and the click of the latch springing open rang out crisply in the silent room. The drawer slid open. Inside lay a neatly stacked pile of letters, with a palm-sized velvet box resting on top. She took out the stack of letters. On the envelope of the top one, written in the same delicate handwriting, were the words, "To Ryan, if I never see you again." She handed the letter to the Duke. He took it, broke the seal, pulled out the letter, and began to read. She didn't peek. Instead, she looked down at the velvet box in the drawer. The box was made of deep blue velvet, its trim worn down to the lining, clearly having been caressed countless times. She opened the box to find a ring inside. It was unlike any ring she had ever seen in the southern aristocratic circles. It was far heavier than those, its face a deep gray gemstone, cut somewhat irregularly, yet with a pattern within it she had never seen before, as if a drop of ink had fallen into water, frozen in the very moment it hit the surface. Those winding ink streaks glowed faintly with a dark red fluorescence in the dim light, like a flame sealed deep within a layer of ice. She held the ring up to the light. Inside the band, a line of small characters was engraved in fine strokes, clearly etched with an extremely delicate tool. She leaned in to make out the ancient script. "Blood of the silver wolf, undying in frost. This is the token of the Duchess of the North." The butler's voice came from the doorway, tinged with a reverence and reverie akin to a pilgrim entering a sacred site. "The Crest Ring, every duchess receives it on her wedding night. To wear it is to bind herself to the bloodline of the Silver Wolf clan, until death do them part. Before the old mistress passed away, she locked it in this very drawer. Everyone assumed it had perished with her, but it turns out she left it here." The Duke looked up, still clutching his mother's letter in his hand, a faint red ring circling his eyes. He had held back all his tears, but the skin around his eyes betrayed him. The tiny blood vessels had turned a pale red from excessive congestion, making him look like a beast that had just been flayed. Both ferocious, and in agony. He looked at the ring in Serena's hand, his expression shifting rapidly and complexly. First shock, then pain, then something that had settled after a fierce struggle, something that could almost be called resolve. He folded his mother's letter and slipped it into his shirt pocket, then pushed his wheelchair 2 steps towards Serena. "Give me the ring." She placed the velvet box in his outstretched palm. He took the ring, clenched it in his fist, closed his eyes, the veins on the back of his hand bulging, and froze in his wheelchair for about 3 breaths. Then he opened his eyes. "This isn't a keepsake she left for me," he said, his voice becoming unusually clear, as if he'd suddenly found a definite path through the fog. "It's a keepsake she left for the next Lady of the North. She knew I would remarry. She arranged all of this before the rebellion broke out. Those arrows, those strategies, this letter, and this ring. She knew she might die. She chose to stay to ensure I could hold the North." He looked up at Selena, the ring in his hand casting a faint, yet steady crimson glow in the dim room. "Your hand," he said. She didn't move, not out of fear, but because the moment felt too heavy. So heavy she didn't dare reach out to take it lightly. "You haven't asked if I'm willing," she said, her voice soft but steady. The Duke looked at her and remained silent for a long time. The night wind outside suddenly picked up, causing the window frames to creak faintly. The pile of the carpet on the floor lay slightly flattened by the draft, and the map covered in red arrows on the wall bulged slightly, like a lung breathing. "Do you consent?" he asked. Those 4 words coming from his mouth were even more unbelievable than the laughter she'd heard from him yesterday. The Duke of the North, the kingdom's last living legend of the battlefield, who in 3 years had never said please or thank you or anything with a hint of negotiation to anyone. He was asking her if she consented. He needed her to be willing. Not because of a contract, not because of politics, not because of those damned mines and silver veins. He needed her to be willing, because if this ring, left by his mother, were slipped onto the finger of a reluctant woman, the symbol would become the most vicious irony. His mother was willing to die for the North, and she, the bride wearing that same ring, had at least to be willing to stay. Serena looked at the ring, then at the sleeping orange cat in the Duke's arms, then at the map of the kingdom on the wall, torn to shreds by red arrows, then at the pool of ink on the dressing table that had been dry for 3 years, and the suicide note folded into the Duke's chest. Then she remembered the words she had spoken to herself in the mirror yesterday. "I cannot be sent back." She changed her mind. It wasn't can't, it was won't. She reached out her hand, not with the elegant curled fingers of a lady, but with her palm open, palm up, as if setting down something too heavy and burdensome that she could finally stop holding. Her palm lines were jumbled. There were tiny red marks on her palm from holding the cat yesterday, and dirt from the garden was caked between her fingernails. The Duke took her fingers in his hand. His hand was still cold, but unlike yesterday, this time he held her tightly, his knuckles pressing firmly against the back of her hand, as if to confirm that her existence was not an illusion, not a conspiracy, not just another name to be buried beneath the wall of roses. He slipped the ring onto her middle finger. The band was icy cold. The moment it touched her skin, Serena felt an extremely subtle vibration travel from the ring's surface into her finger bones. It was no illusion. Inside the deep gray gemstone, the frozen ink, like patterns, began to flow ever so slowly upon contact with her skin's warmth, as if something sealed away for too long had sensed a call and was beginning to awaken beneath the ice. A dark red glow emanated from the depths of the gem, pulsing in concentric circles, as if breathing. The butler knelt at the doorway. It was not a ceremonial bow, but a genuine kneeling on both knees, his forehead pressed against the floor, his shoulders shaking violently. Down the furrows of his aged face, cloudy tears streamed, falling onto the carpet and spreading silently. "Lady Elena," he called out a name that had gone unspoken for 3 years into the empty room, his voice shattering like glass crushed under a carriage's wheels. The one you have waited 3 years for has finally arrived. Serena looked down at the ring on her finger, which emitted a dim red glow. The ink-like patterns within the gemstone were still shifting, so slowly it seemed as though it would take centuries to complete a single cycle. But it was moving. It had come to life. The orange cat jumped down from the Duke's lap, walked to her feet, looked up at her, and let out a clear, no longer hoarse meow. In the distant southern realm, within the obsidian tower, at the very heart of the Earl of Heston's domain, a man clad in a deep red velvet robe suddenly set down the quill he held in his hand. The confidential letter he had been writing lay half-finished before him, ink dripping from the nib and spreading across the page into a series of black dots. He turned his head, gazing toward the north. The oil lamp sitting on the corner of the table suddenly flickered without a breeze. The flame shot upward violently, only to be forced back down the next second, reduced to a tiny flicker on the verge of extinction, like a thread that might snap at any moment. The flickering light swept across his face, illuminating a profile older, darker, and colder than that of the Duke of the North. The corners of his mouth slowly curved upward, forming an extremely faint, subtle arc, not out of joy, but because he had finally awaited the variable worthy of his personal intervention. The blood of the silver wolf shall not perish in the frost. He recited this ancient oath, one he should never have known, each word like a shard of ice spat from the back of his tongue. When he finished, he laughed softly. It was a light, faint laugh, like a knife slowly scraping across glass. Interesting, much more interesting than the original one,